Welcome everyone to this session, In Conversation Russia. This is one of the more sort of chattier sessions at the Battle of Ideas. My name is Will Vernon, I'm a producer at BBC News. I'd like to start off by thanking SAB Miller, who are the sponsors for this particular strand of sessions, Wrestling with the World. SAB Miller has supported the Battle of Ideas for a number of years, and we're very grateful for their continued support. The time at which I was initially asked to produce a session on Russia feels like a million years ago now, and in news agenda terms, it kind of is. Russian politics and Russia's place in the world have become increasingly relevant and high on the agenda in recent months, especially with Russia's ongoing support for the Syrian government. Vladimir Putin has increasingly been characterized as the West bogeyman, a role that Moscow hasn't really played since the Cold War. Pussy Riot, anti-gay legislation, and the imprisonment of opposition leaders, are these the signs of a repressed people? Opinion polls suggest not. But what does this mean, really? Do Russians like a strong leader, or are they just sort of flailing around for a bit of stability after 20 years of hardship? And what about the West's relationship with Russia? Some Russian critics accuse Western governments of treating Russia like a petulant child. Is this true? Why? All the sorts of things we're going to discuss. So I'll just quickly introduce my panel. I'm very happy they're all here because they're all experts and brilliant people. So to my immediate left is Lucy Ash, who began her radio career as a producer in the BBC Moscow Bureau in 1990. She lived in a tiny flat in a massive Stalinist skyscraper from where she had a bird's eye view of the White House during the aborted putsch of August 1991. She's now a presenter at BBC Radio Current Affairs. She's a regular presenter and reporter on Crossing Continents, and in 2010 she made a report about a Russian human rights campaigner murdered in Chechnya, which was awarded both a Sony Gold Award and a Foreign Press Association Award. So welcome, Lucy.
Thank you.
And to my immediate right is one of the country's most respected commentators on Russia, the EU and the US, Mary Dejevsky, who's worked as a foreign correspondent all over the world, and she's a columnist and former chief editorial writer at The Independent and regularly appears on radio and television, so welcome. To my far right is Edward Lucas, who's international editor of The Economist, has been covering Central and Eastern Europe for more than 20 years, witnessing the final years of the last Cold War, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The New Cold War was his first book. His latest book, Deception, was published in March last year. And last but not least, to my far left, is Mikhail Epstein, who's a literary theorist and critical thinker and professor of Russian and cultural theory at Durham University. He has authored 22 books and approximately 600 essays and articles, some of which are translated into 17 languages. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to kick off with a question, and I'm going to start off by asking Ed. Ed, do you think the portrayal of Russia in the West is a sort of fair one?
I think that the West is always a bit behind what's happening, and I think that's partly just a general problem with Western perceptions, that if you talk to experts in any field, they will maybe give you an idea of what the conventional wisdom is going to be in a few months or a few years' time. I think that there's been, particularly with Russia, there's been a lot of wishful thinking. I think every new Soviet leader, probably since Stalin, we've greeted with enthusiasm, hoping that it's going to be better than the last one. We welcomed Brezhnev, we welcomed Gorbachev, I suspect we certainly welcomed Andropov. We may have even welcomed Chernenko. I believe the Washington Post wrote a very favourable article about Chernenko when he was briefly in between Andropov and Gorbachev. We welcomed Yeltsin, we welcomed Putin. And so there's always this sort of cycle of wishful thinking. I think with Putin there was a great desire to believe that he was going to be our kind of Russian leader, and he wasn't. He's an ex-KGB guy, he sees things his own way. He's become increasingly unhappy with the West, and some of that unhappiness has come across in the media and the Western worldview sooner, and some of it took rather longer. I think we've particularly underestimated the effect of Russian money in the West. We tend to assume that we're kind of impregnable, and actually I think Russian money, both clean money and dirty money, makes quite a difference, and we've been a bit unwilling to accept that. I think we tend to overestimate in our assessment of what's going on in Russia the sort of inside politics of Moscow, and we probably rather overestimate the importance of the opposition, and we underestimate some of the big long-term trends that are happening in the Russian provinces.
Recently, there's been an awful lot of coverage of the opposition movement, opposition figures like Alexei Navalny. Lucy, do you think that these opposition figures are actually, popular or relevant to most Russians, or are they sort of just, darlings of the Western media?
There's this idea that outside Moscow and St. Petersburg and maybe Nizhny Novgorod and Yekaterinburg, there's this kind of huge mass of illiterate peasants who will worship Putin. And I just don't actually think that that's true anymore. I mean, there's some things that are so dysfunctional in Russia now that it impinges on almost everybody's life, namely the total lawlessness and the fact that the police are a sort of predatory police force. They call them werewolves in epaulets, that's the Russian expression. And a lot of people say to me that if they see a police officer coming down the street, they'll cross over and walk on the other side of the road because they're so afraid of them. It's not a joke. And I went to Primorye, which is, the maritime region of Russia by Vladivostok, to investigate a story that I found very shocking, which is a group of young men who called themselves the Primorsky partisans murdered 2 policemen. And they released a video on YouTube of them hiding out in the forest wearing camouflage gear, talking about how they had to launch this war because they'd been unfairly treated and tortured in police detention, etc. And what really shocked me is how many Russians, ordinary Russians, hailed these people who'd committed murder as heroes. And it showed me that, there is an incredibly deep disillusion with the way that things are run and a real despair about getting justice. I think that's one of the most fundamental things. A slightly sort of bitchy diplomat in the Quai d'Orsay said, Russia is no longer an emerging country, it's a submerging country. And I think that's quite unfair in some respects, and a lot of things have been achieved, since Putin's been in power. As Russian officials never tire of telling you how they got rid of the chaos of the 90s, the chaos, and all that.
That is an important point, isn't it, Mary, perhaps? Putin has done a hell of a lot of good in Russia.
No.
Okay. But,
what Putin has done is that, at least in his first 2 terms, he brought a measure of stability to a country which had suffered 15 to 20 years, a whole generation of almost complete chaos for different strata of the population. That effect of stability, I would agree with Lucy and to an extent with Ed, that that's starting to wear off. That stability, in the sense that Putin brought it, is no longer maybe enough. But that doesn't mean to me that Putin's popularity is about to fade completely. At the moment, he is the single person that people look to for any sort of measure of law and order. And one, I think, of the biggest misinterpretations of Putin outside Russia is that he is actually a strong leader. We have this predisposition to see Russian leaders as strong and to see Russian people as liking and lauding a strong leader. I think that's wrong in both cases, and I think it's wrong in relation to Putin, that Putin is vulnerable. Putin is weak. His rule doesn't extend nearly as far as anybody thinks it does. Lucy talked about the situation in Primorye and essentially partisans, vigilantes. You had this situation in Moscow about 10 days ago where you had riots on the streets over a racist incident. Putin's power is much, much smaller than people think it is, and it diminishes the further away from Moscow you get.
Mikhail, the kind of this new wave of Russian nationalism that's been, that some might say has been orchestrated by Putin. How important do you think that is to understand that when we're talking about Russia? Because there's been a kind of resurgence in the Russian Orthodox Church. Mary talked about riots, increasing antagonism towards immigrants in Russia. Do you think that this is something that ordinary Russians support?
I think that pure nationalism, if such combination of words is possible at all, is not very feasible in Russia, because Russians are connected to Ukrainians, Tatars, Jews, Germans, with so multiple ethnic and cultural connections that I cannot imagine some pure Russians to be a slogan that would gain popularity in Russia. And also thinking about orthodoxy, as you mentioned, the recent poll conducted a year ago regarding religious identities in Russia showed an interesting change. It used to be thought that 80% of Russian population are Orthodox, because they were asked in the wrong way. Are you Orthodox? Yes, we are. And then it turned out that many of them don't believe in God, don't go to the church, and so on. So when the question was changed to do you belong to Russian Orthodox Church, it turned out that only 41% of Russians are Orthodox. And the second largest group comes with a very strange category of people who do believe in God, but do not belong to any denomination at all. They are called бедные верующие in Russian, which would be translated as poor believers or minimal believers. They do believe in God, but they don't identify themselves to any confession, any denomination at all. And when I recently talked with at the Department of Religious Study at Moscow State University, I was struck that even they haven't heard about this group of population. So there is a great disparity between the actuality of Russian beliefs and the level of their understanding.
So perhaps it's a more political identity than a religious one.
It's a religious identity, but I think it has a huge political consequences, because now Orthodox Church claims to become the state church, and the quick transition from mass atheism to so-called theocracy, that means the rule by church, is so sudden and sad for many people, especially with this Pussy Riot incident, that I can foresee that many people will just break their connections to Orthodox Church as much as this church will associate itself with the state.
Mm-hmm.
Could I say something about Russian identity and religion in the Orthodox Church? I mean, up this end of the table, we were actually whispering to ourselves Anglicanism, because there is quite a sense in which the Orthodox Church in Russia is now the established church, and there is a similar difference between the proportion of people who would say they were practicing, they were church-going, as opposed to people who would identify themselves with, as it were, the national component of being Orthodox. And I think there is a distinction there, but I don't think that the 80% figure is completely wrong, or that it's a wrong question to ask people about their identification with orthodoxy. I'd also add a broader point about national identity, that when communism collapsed at the end of 91, it was presented as indeed the collapse of communism and the extension of the historical process that had been seen right across East and Central Europe. But in Russia, in the old Soviet Union, I think it was also, to an extent, a victory of Russia over the Soviet Empire and over the Soviet Union. And that what we've been seeing for the last 20 years has been a sort of resurgence of being Russian and a rebuilding of Russian national identity. And I think that's a point that's often lost, and that orthodoxy is part of that.
I'm very sceptical about the rebirth of Russian national identity, partly for the reasons that Mikhail mentioned, that the idea that there is a sort of pure Slavic Russianness that you can build an identity on is, I think, a fantasy. And I think the idea of building Russia as a kind of non-imperial state where Russians and non-Russians have really an equal say is also very difficult. But I think I was perhaps a bit too polite about Putin at the beginning. I'm going to try and stir up some disagreement. I think it's been a catastrophic failure, actually. He had unlimited money. He had absolutely, the oil and gas revenues were pouring in, and he had enormous popularity. And in the 13 years that he's had, he could have done anything he wanted. And he could have really modernised Russia. He could have built roads and railways and universities and hospitals. He could have sorted out the healthcare and the pension system. He could have really catapulted Russia out of the backwardness, which I think is the long-term legacy of the Soviet Union. And he didn't do it. Instead, he and his friends stole tens of billions of dollars, and they stole it very blatantly.
No, he didn't do it because he didn't hold the levers of power to be able to do it.
He had enough of the levers of power to confiscate the assets from one lot of oligarchs and then give them to other oligarchs. And just look at the way in which Khodorkovsky, I have no brief for Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia, his company, the most valuable company in Russia, was nationalised. Well, fair enough. Maybe it deserved to be nationalised. Maybe it was all based on stolen property. And then it goes to Putin's cronies in a rigged auction. You look at the way that Gazprom has been looted. This is money flowing out of the pockets of the Russian people and flowing into bank accounts in Switzerland and Liechtenstein and actually the city of London and into property prices here. And I think when you say Putin's popular, I think you have to ask, well, hang on, are these hard questions being asked? Because the answer is they're not. Russian television, which is where most Russians get their news, doesn't say to Putin, where's all the money gone? Who are all these immensely rich people that even I can't name in the West because I'm afraid of being sued for libel? Who are all these immensely rich people who managed to buy oil and gas so very cheaply from the state-owned companies and then sell it at world prices? Those sort of questions don't get asked. The questions about how Putin came to power, those apartment block bombings that made everybody panic, so suddenly he went from being zero to hero. Nobody asks about those, and if people do ask about them, not in the mainstream media, if they ask about them outside the mainstream media, they end up dead. So I think the idea that Putin is really, really popular is a mirage. And if you drill down into the polling and you look at and ask people, are you happy with healthcare? Are you happy with education? Are you happy with transport? Are you happy with criminal justice? It's no, 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 no.
Okay, so, right. Lots to go on there.
I will continue when I've drawn breath.
Okay. So I think Putin, though, does remain, according to opinion polls, he does remain popular. And, you know, I think you could say that Russians are under no illusions. They know what kind of system it is. They know what kind of man Putin is. So how is he staying in power?
Well, I think, talking about national identity, I think there's quite an interesting trend that was picked up by a young journalist called Ben Judah, who just wrote a book called Fragile Empire, which is very good. I recommend it to everyone. He talks about Putin came to power quite a lot by pulverizing Chechnya. You know, Grozny was destroyed only like Dresden. If you see the pictures of it, it's very shocking. There was a very nationalistic rhetoric about we're going to kind of murder them when they're in the shit house, he said. Talking about the Chechens, there was an idea that he was a real Russian mujik, a strong man, and he positioned himself very much as this saviour of the Russian soul, of the Russian national pride. But then with the oil boom, all these migrants started pouring in to Russia to do the jobs that a lot of Russians didn't want to do. The Tajiks were sweeping the streets, you know, the Uzbeks were on the building sites, as they have been doing all the stadiums for Sochi recently. And Putin's a little bit in a bind here because, you know, on the one hand, he says that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. So he can't be too nationalistic against all these people that have come from the former republics. And I think that sort of contradiction is one of the biggest challenges that he's facing at the moment. And the tide of xenophobia in Russia is truly frightening and appalling to witness, as those attacks on the market showed last week.
The tide of xenophobia is, of course, not unconnected with the resurgence of Russian identity. And, I mean, as Lucy rightly said, the leadership is in a huge dilemma because on the one hand it's saying we need more manpower, we've got a shortage of people, we need the country to be rebuilt, we've got very few people, relatively few people to do it. Those people are going to come in from the former Soviet republics, they speak Russian, they know how we do things, and at the same time the risk is that there's going to be rioting on the streets. And the point that I'd just like to make in connection with that is that when we look from here, the opposition to Putin is usually represented as being people like Navalny and people that we like because they look closer to us in their priorities and in their political views. But the biggest opposition, not just to Putin, but to Yeltsin before him, has been from the conservative, nationalist, former communist left and the extreme right. And they are not the people that they sort of meet around the back. And they are not the people that the West would ever like to support. But they are the main threat to any Russian leader, both through the 90s and now. And it's absolutely wrong to say that the political threat to Putin comes from liberals like Navalny. It doesn't. It comes from extreme nationalists and from conservative, sort of egalitarians, nostalgic for communism.
I think it's important to point out that a lot of these extremist groups are actually sponsored or run by the FSB in order to scare the West. And we saw this all through the 90s. Whenever Yeltsin needed, I was a correspondent in Moscow in the 90s, and whenever Yeltsin needed more money from the IMF, you'd immediately see some skinheads, rather confused-looking skinheads, marching up and down in Moscow, so he could turn around and say, "See, there's a spectre of fascism. Give me the money." And I think that it may be a sorcerer's apprentice thing, that having flirted with extremism, both, I would argue, in the extremists in the Caucasus and these Russian skinheads, that they may have taken on a life of their own, in which case that is troubling. But it's certainly one of the themes that the Putin propagandists and other sort of water carriers come out with again and again, is if you don't like Putin, you'll like who comes next even less. And of course the implied message of that is therefore be nice to Putin. And I think that's betraying the people of Russia, who deserve to be run neither by crooks nor by fascists.
Mikhail, do you think we're sort of looking at these issues through sort of Western eyes? How do ordinary Russians feel about the state of Russian democracy, about the Putin system?
You see, I think that there is a tendency in the West to politicize Russia, whereas within Russia, what happens there is much more a matter of some psychological, metaphysical, I would say even self-definition. And we have this kind of liberal fallacy that if Russia would have right rulers, everything will be all right, you know. But then why these people vote for Putin, you know? And under any circumstances they will vote for Putin while Putin is in power, because there is a certain magic of power in Russia. For example, there was such a powerful mayor of Moscow, Lushkov, and he was the favorite of Muscovites. But as soon as he lost his power, he was fired by Medvedev. And there were next elections. Nobody even thought about voting for Lushkov because he was out of power at this point. And he was thinking about putting himself on the election bill, and he decided not to. Because whoever has power, he will get power. Who has no power will not get power. And so the psychology of these people is something that needs to be taken into account. Yes, Putin, I believe, is a disaster to Russia, but Russia is a disaster to itself. And why? And why? You know, I think that these latest years could be called, retrospectively in the history of Russia, the period, the end of illusions. We had illusions with Gorbachev perestroika and with early Yeltsin, that as soon as we disintegrate, so to say, Soviet system, socialist, communist system, everything will be okay with Russia. So we were struggling with 70 years of Russian communism, Soviet communism. Now we understand that we have to struggle with 1,000 years of, I don't know how to call it, but which much deeper traditions. It's not just 70 years. It's some tradition of adoring the power, of being passive, of having, of treating freedom as burden, which we have to load to somebody else's shoulders, as Dostoevsky famously said in Grand Inquisitor poem, that there is nothing so hard for human soul as to get this burden of freedom. And people, so the Grand Inquisitor is very actual in contemporary Russia, very actual, because people try to get somebody to whom they can put the burden of responsibility, of freedom, and Putin is in this sense. Some very comfortable.
What about the church? Isn't that also something people are invested? The church.
The church as well. The church as well. But you know, it is amazing how atheism that was implanted in Russia violently for 70 years, in a matter of 2-3 years, changed into, so to say, mass orthodox infatuation. And this is also, by the way, predicted in Grand Inquisitor, because the Grand Inquisitor says, you will ruin, simplifying, you will addressing Christ himself, who is silently listening to him. He said, these people will ruin your churches and will expel us, the priests. They will try to build the Tower of Babel in order to be fed. But they will fail with this Tower of Babel, and they will call us to come back, and we will come back. And by that time we will be persecuted, but we will come back and we'll finish this Tower of Babel in your name, and we'll lie at you in your name. This is the quickest possible transition from atheism to theocracy. And this is what we are observing now in Russia.
I'm very skeptical of this idea that I agree that it's been 1,000 years of abominable history, and with a few very bright spots, which I might go into in a moment. But I think it's too easy to sit back and say, well, the Russians are used to this. They like a vozhd, they like a strong leader. That's what they're used to. Let Putin get on with it. And if anyone here hasn't read it, I suspect most people haven't, but there's a brilliant book by Alexander Etkind called Internal Colonization, which is, and he was at Cambridge, now moved to Italy. But his argument, which I think is a really good one, is that Russia is perhaps the only country in the world whose rulers have treated it the way most countries treat their empires. And it started off with fur. Fur was the oil and gas of the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And you saw this ruthless gang in Moscow, first of all destroying Novgorod and then just pushing its reach further and further east and west. And when the fur ran out, they would just go they would go further on. And his argument is that it encourages a kind of rapacious rent-seeking behaviour, where you don't try and run the country in the way that a proper government should, thinking about its long-term wealth and the citizens. You just try and extract money from it, either from the natural resources or from the rents. And I think that does have deep roots, but I don't blame the Russian people for that. I think it's a tragedy for Russia that it still has these natural resources that are so highly priced. And I actually think the best thing that could happen for Russia right now, and actually since the 90s, is a collapse in the oil price and an uncoupling of the gas price from the oil price, and a properly enforced European single market where they can't do all this rent-seeking, because that would pull the rug from underneath the Kremlin's business model. And we tend to over-personalize things. We tend to think this is Putin. Putin is the front man for a business model. If you can really do something about the business model, you may get rid of Putin and maybe also the regime.
Mary, do you think that maybe a lot of the things that Ed's talked about, you know, dirty money, crime, corruption, you know, the Russian rulers treating their own people like vassals. Do you think a lot of these kind of Cold War stereotypes, these kind of spy stories, do you think they're a useful way of talking about Russia?
No, I think they're an extremely damaging way of talking about Russia. And I think that the extent to which the whole discussion of Russia over the last 20 years has been, as it were, seen through the shadow of the Cold War, has been extremely damaging. And there's a very strange contradiction here, to my mind, which is, on the one hand, the whole discussion of Russia is dominated by a view dictated by the Cold War, by the 60s, 70s, 80s. And on the other hand, one of my biggest complaints about reporting about Russia today is a lack of historical awareness, a lack of how the Soviet Union, how Soviet life actually really was through the 60s, 70s, 80s. And that people who say, well, there's been no change, or it's just the same old Russia or the same old Soviet Union, nothing's really changed in 20 years. Actually, huge amounts of things have changed. But the problem is that we don't see that, and some of it's because of the preconceptions from the Cold War. Some of it is because we concentrate, understandably, on some of the extremely negative things, and we don't look at some of the very positive things. One of them being the enormous increase in standards of living for your average Russian over the last 20 years. 30 years ago, Russians would be getting up at dawn, standing in queues, not able to get meat, fresh fruit, juice at any reasonable price. There would be huge black markets in all of these things. Now there are supermarkets all over Russia where people can get decent produce at prices they can afford. And this has happened in 20 years. I mean, to my mind, this is, every time I go, this is little short of a miracle. So I think that in some ways we exaggerate some things and don't notice other things, because in those particular, relatively, I know that Ed and other people will say, well, ease of daily life is really nothing.
No, I don't say that
compared with the sort of bigger, the bigger ideas of repression and corruption. But I do think that you've basically got to sort that out. And maybe then you'll be able to sort out ideas of, you'll be able to sort out problems of police corruption, politics, everything. I would also just make one completely gratuitous comment on this, but I think that the extent to which Russian money has been able to come to London in particular, come to the UK, with no questions asked as to where it came from, where London is regarded as a safe haven, where lawyers representing Russians who flee to the UK, some for good reasons, some for bad, say, we cannot envisage a situation where we would extradite any Russian back to Russia because we think that the legal system is inadequate, which differentiates us from the US, from France, from Germany, from most people elsewhere in Europe. I think we have a problem. We are complicit in this.
That's interesting. That's an interesting idea, that we have the problem and not Russia. Because I always think when people talk about a sort of that Russia being a state with an overbearing police and security apparatus and no freedom of speech, and I think about the UK and I think about secret courts, anti-terror legislation, people getting arrested for putting things on, people getting arrested for putting things on Twitter, getting arrested for taking photos of police officers.
Come off it.
Hate speech legislation.
Not for doing a 40-minute song in a church, though.
Kettling.
I mean a 40-second, sorry.
Well, that's the most absurd piece of moral equivalence I've heard in a week, and you should be absolutely ashamed of saying that. You really should. There is no comparison.
By the way, I don't actually buy that argument. I was talking specifically about the amount of Russian money and Russian criminals who are basically given refuge in London, and we treat this as a huge amount of brownie points for London as saying what an attractive place we are. Yeah. And I think we should have been asking many more questions about where this money came from, how it managed to cross borders, and that was our responsibility that we flunked.
Can I just ask one very quick question before we go out to questions from the audience? I expect you all read it. I expect most of the audience read Vladimir Putin's column in the New York Times about the Syrian conflict. Lucy, Vladimir Putin as a peacemaker and a believer in the lovely UN that's going to solve all those problems in the Middle East.
Well, I mean, it is certainly a fleet-footed piece of diplomacy. And I think, you know, looking at it through Russian eyes, you can see why a lot of people in Russia feel the West has no right to give them lectures about how to do things, and why the West may have, in many respects, lost moral authority. When they look at, you know, America's foreign policy in Afghanistan, Iraq, it doesn't look exactly very impressive. But, you know, I think that it is very dangerous when you start sort of saying, well, making these kinds of moral equivalences, because I just think that, you know, you want to encourage a higher standard. behaviour and not sort of like look at the worst thing that America might have done to base their foreign policy on. Say it's all right because they've done this, you know, they've behaved badly in Abu Ghraib, so it's fine if we sort of torture our prisoners. I mean, that's ridiculous. And I think that, you know, the fact that bloodshed was averted possibly through this is good, but, you know, you can't...
Bloodshed's continuing.
I mean, yeah, I was just going to say that there's no way of knowing sort of whether it will actually, at the end of the day, have saved that many lives or not. And, you know, there are Russian weapons still being supplied to government troops in Syria, and, you know, there are horrific stories every single time you pick up the newspaper about what's going on there.
But are those government troops fighting Islamists, extremists?
We've ended up with an ideal situation for Putin where you have to choose between his fascist charm and Al-Qaeda. And I think it's very fleet-footed diplomacy. But I would just draw everyone's attention to the fact that there was a time when perhaps a bit of pressure on Assad might have weakened his belief in his invulnerability. And that was a time when the opposition in Syria was largely moderate, although also quite ineffective. But I think we probably want to go on to questions on the floor rather than a whole separate series. I've got about 15 very hostile things that I want to say in a friendly spirit to Mary. But I'm going to save.
Okay, well let's go out to the audience.
Yeah, one of the most chilling scenes that I saw in the Pussy Riot film, A Punk Prayer, was when Putin was being asked, was on state TV, and he was being asked, about his stance, and he said, well, I didn't want to involve myself in this issue, it shouldn't really be my business, but I think it's the business of the state to protect the feelings of the Russian people. Do you think it's quite a sort of chilling kind of move? And I have to confess, now that I've heard that he's not so much a fascist dictator, but maybe an elite technocrat with little power who doesn't believe in infrastructure, I think maybe he is a bit more of a Western leader than we give him credit for. I mean, the more serious question that I do want to get into is how effectively does Putin manage the threat of kind of Western intervention within his policies? Does that help shore up his power? That seems to be the perception, that he can use the idea that Russia has been dictated to by aid organisations, NGOs, the UN, to prop up his power? Or is that actually just an illusion that he sells back to the West?
Hi, I'm from Vietnam, and I also work in the oil and gas industries before, so I can relate a bit. So firstly, in terms of oil and gas, it takes a lot of money. It takes like $1 billion to, to explore an oil field to see if it has oil or not. So, and it takes a lot of money to maintain the oil field. And I think like the way that Russian go, which is to let the oligarchs to buy the oil field cheaply, to develop them and then nationalize the back, is a great way to go, because it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of risk to be able to, get the oil up and running, because otherwise you will, if you do a poor job, then the oil will just flow for like a few years and then you totally waste the whole thing. And secondly, I'm coming from Vietnam, and traditionally we are like communists. So the things like there a huge proportion of the population, like of Vietnamese people, are they still live in the age of communism, and it takes a great effort to change things. First, we need to lift people out of poverty first, like get them to get access to the internet, get them to get access to school before we can talk about free speech and things. Yeah.
From World Wide Citizen TV. Quick things. First of all, I just wanted to defend Will, not because I think he was suggesting any kind of equivalence on unfreedoms in Britain, but it just feels like there is so much finger pointing at Russia on these things that mean that we don't question some of the real problems that we have in terms of unfreedoms domestically. Specifically, for example, I found it quite repugnant, and I'm no fan of Putin or the old Stalinist system, but I found it repugnant that sort of the left and half the world were finger pointing at Putin over the illegalisation of teaching homosexuality within sex education, for example, particularly given that in Britain it was criminalised from 1987 for 10 years. You couldn't teach about homosexuality equally in UK education. And I do find that there's a rather pugnant amount of finger pointing. And I have felt similarly, and you see, you almost feel like you can't say these things, otherwise you're supporting backwardness. I have felt that the way in which people here have gone bananas over Russia's relationship to Syria, it's been a very similar thing, almost recreating a sort of East-West phenomena. So I just want your thoughts on that. And lastly, very quick question, what does motivate Russian foreign policy now? We have seen the sort of end of realpolitik everywhere. Everyone else has taken up the humanitarian nonsense. But what does Russia do in relation to that?
Thank you.
The panel have painted what I'm sure is a realistic but very depressing picture of Russia. I just wondered if you see any way in which there might be a positive way forward. Is this going to stay the same for many years, or do you see any prospect for positive change?
Mikhail, you want to address any of the points there?
Well, the last question. You see, it usually coincided in Russia, I mean, political stagnation with cultural proliferation. And this was the case in the early 20th century with the silver age of Russian culture, whereas there was very reactionary and hopeless situation within Russia. Then it was the case in the 1960s. And I think that now our greatest hope is that this energy of decay, energy of disintegration of Russia, because I don't think there is any way for Russia to keep its current borders. It is disintegrating, and current stagnation is the form of retarded disintegration. That the energy of disintegration will feed Russian culture, which I believe now is in a good shape. It's not very visible to the external world, but Russian literature, Russian artistic imagination is in a very good shape, and this is where I put my major hope.
First of all, on the oil and gas point, the Russian oil and gas industry is the most incompetent in the world. If you just look at Gazprom's share price. If you own any Gazprom shares, please sell them right now. That's not official investment advice. It's just common sense. These companies are used as kitties for looting by the Kremlin. They're not developing new oil and gas fields. Just look. You can look at the map. I think that this whataboutism is crippling. If you start saying, take the biblical thing, we can't criticise the mote in someone else's eye until we look at the plank in our own, then you can never criticise another country, because you'll always find something to criticise here. I want to echo the criticisms that the Russians themselves make of their regime, of the very brave human rights people who stand up for the same principles in Russia that we stand up here, and we have a common cause. And I think it's appalling to say to them, because we're worried about the GCHQ, or because we're worried about Northern Ireland, or because we're worried about this, we're not going to support you in your struggle against a bunch of fascist crooks who are ruining and looting your country. I think it would be despicable. I think the governing principle of Russian foreign policy now is a kind of anti-Westernism. Find out what the West wants and try and block it. And they do that pretty effectively. They're helped by the fact that we do what we do so incompetently. But they highlight both our lack of moral high ground and our divisions and all the other things, and they're doing quite a good job. In terms of optimism, I agree. I so agree with you, Mikhail. I think that Russian cultures, I don't think it's been in this good a state since the Silver Age, and perhaps it's even better than that. I think this is fantastic. We've got a really profound, I think, growing cultural self-understanding among Russians in the emigration and in Russia about the way the country is and how it feels about itself. I'd also add economic freedom. We've had 25 years now of people being able to buy and sell and travel and save and invest. And although it's a terribly difficult business climate and there's all this predatory, appalling behaviour by the police and the authorities, people have created little autonomous spaces where they run businesses, they do stuff, and they have money that the state can't take away because it's abroad. Sometimes I think it's stolen money, sometimes it's honestly acquired. But we're never going to go back to that kind of Soviet era where the state controlled everything, could control who you slept with, what you bought, what you sold, whatever you did. That's not coming back. And I think it's a fallacy, therefore, to say that Russians are still governed by the communist mentality. I don't know Vietnam at all, but I think that the problems in Russia are much deeper in terms of the way the state behaves, but I don't think it's particularly communist. And finally, the idea that there's any Western attempt to topple Putin is absolutely ridiculous, and there never has been. And he's got things very, to that extent, well under control by chasing all the NGOs out of Moscow. What I would just mention, and other countries, what I would mention is the EU is doing a very good thing in trying to get Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, to sign deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. It's a really, really important bit.
I mean,
sorry, and what's the Kremlin doing? It's launched trade wars. It's banned Georgian wine, it's banned Moldovan wine, it's banned Ukrainian chocolate. They're now trying to punish Lithuania for daring to host this EU summit. So my final message is, please buy Lithuanian cheese. You can get it at Victoria Station at Liverpool Street. And it's delicious. It's better than Parmesan, it's much cheaper, and it'll ruin Putin's day, and it will enrich your fridge.
Was there not though, an agreement when the Soviet Union broke up that NATO wouldn't encroach, on Russia's borders, providing that the Warsaw Pact was broken?
Russians say that, it's not true.
Well, the question of NATO expansion is a delicate one.
No, it's not. It's very simple.
The undertaking was given to Gorbachev. My view is that an undertaking given to Gorbachev, given that Russia was the successor state, recognized all over the world and in international law as the successor state, which took over the debts, it took over the UN seat, it took over everything, all the Soviet obligations, that a promise made to Gorbachev was a promise made to Yeltsin and was a promise that should have been honored.
And you consign the Baltic states to slavery.
No, it's nothing to do. The Baltic states were already independent.
They wouldn't be allowed to join NATO.
Did not need to join NATO to be independent.
They wanted to, and you'd have kept them out.
Anyway, that's the. There are different views of that. My view is that, and Ed's view is a different view. Going back to, I would obviously agree with the point about negative reporting about Russia. Section 28 in the UK, I think, is an almost exact equivalent to the legislation in Russia. I know the argument that says it was bad legislation here, and it's even worse for Russia actually to introduce something like that. But I don't think you can see it without understanding that that sort of prejudice, it's very, very recent that we have changed in Britain. And those prejudices still exist, not just in Russia, but through lots and lots of the world. And you can say, well, Russia has signed up to be a European country. That is true, but you can't just abandon history overnight. On Syria, I think that also the extent to which the West, quote, was able to exploit Russia's veto at the UN, basically for its own advantage. There was no public will, this was tested by the UK Parliament. It was about to be tested by the US Congress. It was never tested by a vote in France, but the polls were a similar way. There is no appetite in the Western countries who would have done the intervention in Syria for yet another embroilment. And the fact that Russia vetoed resolution after resolution at the UN gave the West a scapegoat, an excuse for not intervening. And finally, when the bluff is called, actually it turns out that Russia's view that isn't peace non-intervention, isn't that better for a country to sort out its own problems than for us to go marching in and make things worse? I think that was a point that simply that was simply ignored at the time. The only other thing I would address was this question of depressing and prospects. I mean, I hope that in a lot of what I said, I haven't actually given the view that everything's terrible and it's all going backwards. I think it's going forwards in a lot of ways. And a couple of years ago, I tried to gauge at what point the majority of Russia's voters would no longer have a memory of the Soviet Union. And it's actually very, very difficult to calculate this because the demographic figures relate to people of working age. They don't really relate to people. My sort of rough calculation was people who were age 7 in the middle of Gorbachev's perestroika, so about sort of mid-late 80s. And my calculation came up with the tipping point at which there would be a majority of voters with no living memory of the Soviet Union would come round about now, between the last presidential election and the next presidential election. And while you can look at the UK, and I would say that I was growing up in the late 50s and 60s, and I think it's only in retrospect that you realise how much those years were overshadowed by your parents' memory of the war, and that it's only quite recently that has faded. That I think if you look at Russia today in the same way, it's going to take a very, very long time for those memories and that legacy to fade away. It's going to have an imprint on the country for a long time to come. But the actual experience of Soviet communism, the people that there will be a majority within the next 5-10 years, there will be a majority of voters, people influencing opinion in Russia, who do not have a memory of the Soviet Union. And then I think things are going to change. Whether we like the direction of that change, of course, that's a different matter. But I think things are going to change very considerably.
Excellent. Lucy?
Talking about the Second World War and about the Soviet mentality, I've just been with a bunch of diggers. They're volunteers, and they exist all over Russia. And they go around looking for the remains of soldiers from World War II. And at the outset, I thought this is probably some sort of government-sponsored thing. Sure enough, when I get to the camp in the forest, there's a picture of Lenin hanging up over the stove while they're making shashliks. And I think this is all this strange, nostalgic throwback to Soviet times, and it's a bit creepy. But actually, it was more nuanced than that. And the place where these soldiers fell, they were under the command of a general who was trashed in history because he surrendered to the Nazis. All his soldiers as well were just left in the forest. I mean, I can't tell you how shocking it is that they're just lying under this much moss and leaves. There are bones everywhere, grenades, bullets. And what emerged talking to these diggers is I feel that there's this kind of birth of a sort of real civic society in them, because they say that they don't like this cult of the unknown soldier, which has been going on through the whole Soviet period with the flame and everything. They say, why are we proud of that? It's something we should be ashamed of. All these people, they were all fathers, brothers, sons, they were all individuals who fell here. And they said, this contempt in Russia for the individual is something that I think more and more people are challenging. On another positive note, I think that, social media is flourishing. Not that many people under 35 are getting their news from television anymore. And I think people are very, very aware. And I'm very impatient with this idea that the Russians aren't fit for democracy, that they need a strong leader. I just think, from all the people that I speak to, I just think that's manifestly untrue.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have we got some really super fast questions? We haven't got a lot of time left.
Just a little insight into the British government attitude. In discussion with a former Foreign Secretary, Member of Parliament for Blackburn, he pointed out to me that all you need to know about Putin is that his grandfather was Stalin's cook.
Just a quick comment to Mary's point about how money comes in from Russia and the ex-Eastern Bloc. So it relies on lawyers, the KYC, fiduciary duty, and of course lawyers extract not a direct commission but a benefit from every penny which comes in, and perhaps leaving such large moral questions in the hands of lawyers is a lesson there.
There have been a number of market reforms in Russia. For example, the IPO of the Moscow Exchange this year and a new super regulator under the central bank. Do you foresee that Moscow could take on New York or London in the next 10 years as a financial centre?
No.
So it's not something we hear about very often. What kind of advancement do you see culturally and economically east of the Urals?
I went to the place where Khodorkovsky used to be locked up in Chita, which is on the Chinese border, because I heard that there was a huge amount of illegal logging going on there that even the Environment Minister was shocked by, and it's quite hard to shock ministers. It seemed that people were so desperately poor there and so sort of in this swamp, this bolata that they talk about in Russia, that they would sell a tree trunk, which is worth about $100, just a pine tree trunk, for a bottle of vodka. Then I go onto the other side of the border, into China, into a place called Manjuli, which like 20 years ago, there was nothing there. It was just a tiny little settlement. Now it's kind of full of huge hotels where Russians go and spend their money having massages and lots of other sorts of services and go shopping. And, you know, it was just really, really remarkable. The contrast between China and Russia, it just really did my head in. And I thought, why is this? I mean, you know, why isn't Russia using its vast raw materials, its wood and everything, and doing processing of its own? And there's this huge fear about, there's a huge xenophobia in Russia's Far East, because they basically think that they're going to be very soon overtaken demographically, economically by the Chinese.
Thank you. Ed, do you want to come back on any of the points?
Russia's basically stuck under its current regime because it can't go in. It wanted a multipolar world, and it got it, and it doesn't like it. It's too weak to be a pole in a multipolar world. It doesn't want an alliance with China because, as Piontkowski said, that would be an alliance between a rabbit and a boa constrictor. It doesn't want to go in with a kind of global Muslim South because A, it doesn't exist, and B, they wouldn't like the Russians. And that really leaves it, I think, only with the chance of the option of going westward. And I think sooner or later, first of all, I agree with Mikhail, I think Russia is going to disintegrate, at least to some extent. But what's left, I think, will have to be Western-oriented because there's nowhere else to go. And it's really just a question of how much money is stolen and wasted and how many more lives are ruined until that finally happens.
Mikhail?
Well, I think if there is something positive in current condition of Russia is that Russia always tried to live either in the future or in the past, in the communist future or linking to the tradition of the past, of monarchy, of the church, of orthodoxy. Now it is the short period of time, perhaps first in Russian history, where Russians get to know how to live in the present. And this is something which may have some deep educational and ultimately political effect on them. How to live in the present, not with some grand visionary project. But what does it mean not to have any project, not to have any utopia? And I think this is what is both spiritually and pragmatically positive about Putin's spirit, not due to Putin, but contrary to Putin, so to say.
I'd just like to say one thing about development east of the Urals. I think it's very patchy. I think there are places like Chitan, close to the Chinese border, where the development is all on the other side and it's very, very, very conspicuous. But if you go to somewhere like Vladivostok, Nakhodka, you go to Krasnoyarsk, these places have, economically, they're flourishing, but they're also an illustration of being far from Moscow. You're very little under Moscow's influence, and they are an illustration of how the central writ doesn't run so far from the center.